Female or feminine rage can be described as the frustration or anger felt regarding injustice faced by women, normally due to patriarchal systems that enable misogyny. From Ovid's version of the Medusa myth to the 1978 revenge movie I Spit on Your Grave and the 2023 song Labour by Paris Paloma, female rage has been documented in media and become a popular trope. Critics have argued that this phenomenon has romanticized experiences of women and turned it into a fantasy fulfillment genre, fictionalizing and trivializing them in the process. In this video, I intend to look back over women's rights throughout the years to explain female rage and examine several pieces of media that utilize this trope, and assess whether or not the dissent is accurate. I'd be amiss if I did not note that this analysis will be extremely cis-heteronormative, and that societal structures based on gender roles also harm trans individuals and AMAB, assigned male at birth. It is not my intent to erase or ignore this fact, yet it is the nature of this ideology and systems based on birth sex that forces to put people into boxes. It forces us to think rigidly. I'll obviously be unable to deep dive into all women's rights throughout history and throughout the world because that could be a video in itself, potentially hours long. Instead, I'll mostly focus on Western history and hone in on key events. For further information on a woman's role, you can watch my video on dissecting the damsel in distress. Primitive society was insanely basic, focused solely on survival and reproduction. This largely separated the sexes of humans into two groups: those who could have children, females, and those who could not, men. Pregnancy itself is a delicate time, especially in a period without healthcare, and takes 9 months, meaning our female ancestors were forced to take a backseat to other affairs such as hunting and protecting a tribe. This instead was taken up by the males of their community. It is important to note that there is evidence of female participation in militaristic affairs throughout the ages, and this wasn't a one-fits-all rule. However, if we observe only the biological aspects, it's obvious where later expectations of women came from. Hunting and protection would evolve into working a 9 to 5, and child-rearing would become being a housewife. These archaic survival mechanisms grew into gender roles that early humans kept to even during the development of civilizations. Women being kept to the mothering role, exasperated by the fact that infant mortality was insanely high for a large majority of history, and having as many children as humanly possible was important to continue a family line. The patriarchal societies that insisted upon male children keeping the family name, inheriting any assets, and having sons to work the family business, as women were not permitted to work, intensified the need for a healthy son. This in turn increased the risk of death for women in regards to childbirth complications. Thankfully for both the children and mothers, healthcare has improved significantly. The problem herein is now humans have sentience, free will to choose, and are not bound by biological destiny. We can choose to have children or to not have children at all. Women can now either stay at home or work, or do a combination of both. Many of the systems in place that placed women at a disadvantage have now been abolished. For example, allowing women equal inheritance rights or allowing women to work in turn meant that their mothers were not pressured to pop out sons constantly. Beliefs in the traditional roles and the insistence women adhere to only being homemakers rely exclusively on primitive ideas of gender. Legal intervention solidified the desires of women into rights. The Married Women's Property Act 1870 allowed married women to be the legal owners of property they earned and to inherit property. This was only for women who were married, but it was progress. Equal Franchise Act of 1928 gave men and women equal voting rights. And for the next act, I'm going to have to substitute a few words. The Adult Offences Act 2003 outlawed marital, non-consensual adult relations. Yes, up until 2003, it was legal in the United Kingdom for a husband to force his wife into bed. Contemporary analysis of how women were treated due to traditional gender roles that in turn derived from prehistoric behaviour notes how oppressive these systems were. Women still suffer due to some still holding these beliefs, and some countries across the world still enforcing these with their own laws. The recognition that this was oppression and that this still exists, whether ideologically or is still legally in place, with a Western mindset has led to what is known as female rage. It is both the emotions held by individual women due to their experiences with misogyny and a collective feeling on behalf of all women, past and present. With female rage explained, let's get into examples of female rage. Ovid and Medusa. Ovid, a Roman poet living between 43 BC and 17/18 AD, documented the Greek myth of Medusa. In his telling, Medusa was a beautiful woman who got busy with Poseidon in Athena's temple. As punishment, Athena cursed her by transforming her into a gorgon. Ovid somewhat gave a backstory to Medusa, as prior to her tellings had the figure always being a gorgon. While previous versions and Ovid's version did not include non-consensual activity, later ones included the tidbit that Medusa did not consent to Poseidon. In the 20th century, feminists appropriated the Medusa myth take that asserted her as a survivor of violence and held her as a symbol of female rage. In this way, Medusa is a victim of both Poseidon and also Athena. Poseidon who violated her and Athena who blamed her for her assault. This reflected the then current attitudes towards female survivors, being that the previously mentioned Adult Offences Act was not in place and husbands could still force their wives into bed. The notion a survivor was asking for it by wearing revealing clothing or drinking is still a point brought up today, although a much less common sentiment than it has been previously. The next figure we'll be talking about is Lilith, and in some video or another I always have to apologise for my pronunciation to at least one branch of my family tree. Lilith is a figure in Jewish folklore first appearing around 700 to 1000 AD. As the story goes, she was Adam's first wife, but she refused to be submissive and she left the garden, which led to the creation of Eve. Lilith then got busy with the archangel Samuel, bearing demonic offspring that became incubi and succubi. Later versions assert that her disobedience to Adam led her to becoming a demon herself as she sprouted wings to leave the garden, or that God himself banished her for not obeying and turned her into a demon. In various cultures, Lilith is known to prey on infants and seduce men, although some also know her to target men on behalf of scorned women. Infant mortality rates were incredibly high due to SIDS and disease, and Abrahamic society may have seen an example of an unruly woman and in turn demonize her by manufacturing folklore that places her as the cause of it. Modern Jewish feminists claim her as a symbol of autonomy, independence, and sexual liberation. Lilith is an example of female rage, originates from her punishment for refusing to be submissive to Adam, a man. In turn, she lashes out at men who choose to harm women, and many women who relate to this, being forced to be submissive and obedient, may take her on as a symbol of empowerment and rage. This next example I'm about to talk about is probably one of the most notorious examples of female rage being used as a trope and fetishized. The 1978 film I Spit on Your Grave is a slasher movie which has spawned 4 sequels and a 2010 remake. In the movie, a woman, Jennifer, takes deadly revenge against a group of men who objectify and violate her. It was primarily criticised for having the overly gratuitous assault scene of Jennifer, which sparked the events for her to get revenge. I won't be going into what happens in the assault scene, but by God, was it unnecessary? Those who were dissenting said that they felt like the assault was merely there to be a plot mechanic, which is true, it's the catalyst for the events of the rest of the movie. It did have to happen in order for the rest of the plot to make sense, otherwise it's just a woman going round on a massacre for no apparent reason. But it was unnecessarily long and unnecessarily explicit. It's also important to note that this movie was written and directed by a man, whose response to the controversy was, "Frankly, I'm not concerned whether it receives bad press or not. It doesn't touch me one way or the other whatsoever. If you told me that the public does not like it and the critics like it, then there is something very, very bad about that. Who am I reaching? 300 critics around the United States or 2,000 around the world? It's really the public that counts, the 20 million who have seen the film around the globe." Which is a really weird statement because even the public were protesting against this movie. People were rallying against it because it was so inappropriate for a time where people were talking about violence against women and women's rights in a big way. It was the 1970s. So there's two separate parts to this. It's a man that is writing about the experiences of a woman who has experienced extreme violence at the hands of men, and he's turned that experience, which for some women is a very real experience, into a shock movie. It's even worse when you realise that he got the idea for this movie by meeting a woman who had been beaten and violated by two men in a park in New York City. Unlike the other two mentions of female rage, I would have to admit that in this scenario, yes, it is definitely exploiting women, and it's trivialising and making light of very serious things. The stories of Medusa and Lilith are fictionalised, much like I Spit on Your Grave, but in a way where it doesn't feel like that's supposed to be the outcome. For example, we aren't expected to turn into gorgons and make the people who hurt us turn into stone. We aren't expected to become a demon and start preying on men who hurt women. The two mythological stories have since been taken by women and used as a source of empowerment. They've been reclaimed from being victims to being examples of women who are strong. I Spit on Your Grave, on the other hand, is an example of a man who heard a woman's real story, heard real experiences, and turned it into a movie that include a gratuitous and explicit and elongated assault scene. The next movie I would like to talk about that also has themes of female rage is the 2003 K1ll Bill. Beatrice Kiddo, a pregnant woman, is shot during her wedding rehearsal by her ex Bill and his assassination squad. Beatrice goes into a coma, waking up 4 years later and learns that she has lost her baby and fiancé. She resolves to get revenge on all involved in the massacre. Cultural historian Maud Larvin also commented on the themes of female rage and fantasy fulfillment within K1ll Bill. The difference is, K1ll Bill wasn't conceived based on the experiences of a real woman. There was a female editor on staff, and also it's primarily a martial arts movie, not a slasher movie. The plot also includes flashbacks where we get additional context about the series of events that we're currently watching. It's not simply a terrible, violent, explicit thing happens to woman seeks violent revenge. The intent of the movie was to have cool martial arts choreography, not to shock viewers. I'm not saying that bad things can't happen to female characters and that female characters can't be angry or want revenge against the people who did those things. I'm saying it doesn't have to be a drawn-out, explicit, horrific attack that ends with a protagonist that you really can't relate to or understand on any level because it's a plank of a human being who only exists to give you the shock. The things we know about Jennifer by the end of I Spit on Your Grave. She goes and rents a cottage because she wants to write a novel. She is assaulted by many men. With Beatrice, we get a pretty good idea of who she was and who she is, what her previous occupation was, her involvement in the squad. We know both of her parents' names. It isn't a case of, well, I conveniently decided to stay in this isolated cottage which just so happens to be surrounded by the worst scum of the earth men you'll ever meet. Let's move on to another one, Labour, a song released in 2023 by Paloma. I would play you the song, but I don't want to get copyright struck, so I'm going to read out the lyrics that I think are pertinent. All day, every day, therapist, mother, maid, nymph, then a virgin, nurse, then a servant, just an appendage, live to attend him so that he never lifts a finger. 24/7 baby machine so he can live out his picket fence dreams. It's not an act of love if you make her, you make me do too much labour. Chef's kiss. She has summarised everything that we've talked about in regards to expectations of women throughout the years. I saw a comment on the music video that stated the line "so that he never lifts a finger" could refer to a wife undergoing emotional and physical labour at home to avoid violence from her husband, as well as him never having to do the work at home. It's got a double meaning. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and a little analysis on female rage. I'll do a follow-up video if there are any other suggestions that my audience has given me for examples of female rage, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!